Thank you for listening to Agile Standup, the show where we talk about all things related to Agile, Scrum, and Kanban, leaving no subject professional, unprofessional, awesome, insensitive, or otherwise untouched. Today, we're going to discuss the importance of sprint planning, backlog refinement, and sprint goals.
Yay!
So, yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's no...
No, I mean, I think this is a really good discussion, John, because I think that everybody runs their sprint planning and grooming sessions. And what was the other one you mentioned?
Backlog refinement.
Okay, so people tend to run those ceremonies differently. So I think it's good for us to talk about how we see those ceremonies.
That's right. And you and I run them two different ways, I think, for
styles.
sure. But it works for both of our teams.
And that's the thing, right? So in
Whatever works
Agile
for the
Scrum,
team.
it's what works best for your team.
Exactly. I say that quite a bit. And anybody that works with me at work, knows that I say that a lot. It's what works for the team. And I always say it depends on how you want to run your shop and all that stuff.
Absolutely.
Ultimately, it's what works for the team.
Exactly.
The way that I run, or I don't want to say run, but the way that I facilitate sprint planning.
Wait, so before you get into the facilitation
Sure.
piece, can you tell us a little bit about why you feel sprint planning is important?
So I feel sprint planning is important because it gives your team the future cast as to what they're going to do next. Also, it allows the team to develop together their sprint goal, which is important. Of course, with input from the product owner, what you get out of that is this is what we want to fulfill. This is our goal, essentially.
And you hear this, people? Sprint goals are really important. And if you talk to the development teams, they love to have sprint goals. They like to know what they're supposed to achieve at the end of every sprint
They
and
need
how
the
they're
target
adding
to hit.
value.
Right.
Exactly.
Yep.
So I like that you just mentioned that, because oftentimes you plan for sprints and there isn't really a goal. It's a bunch of different stuff in the sprint, but you got to have a goal. So I like that. So I'm sorry.
No. It's fine. I mean, potpourri. Excuse me, I'm hitting that mic. But potpourri sprints are not bad to have, but they're also kind of scattered. It's like, whoa, there's a lot going. You're fixing a few bugs here. You're doing this one enhancement. You're doing half of this other enhancement. There's no real, But yeah, you're exactly right. The development team loves that, and it makes the sprint planning process, once you've established that sprint goal, so much easier.
Agreed.
So what I do with my team is we basically go in and we, as a team, kick off our sprint planning session with, let's develop our sprint goals. Once we develop our sprint goals, we all agree to it. Then we start basically putting kind of like either pulling from the backlog that of user stories that we've already discussed in order to satisfy that sprint goal, or we start creating some user stories on the fly that are, and I hate using this term, but kind of like placeholders. Like, we know we need the story, but we have yet to kind of craft out the verbiage inside the user story, the actual user story itself, the acceptance criteria, any other details, etc. Once we get that, and to be honest, I definitely try and get my team, and I say, hey, we definitely want to do the next sprint, the next most sprint, but can we stretch ourselves a little bit more and maybe go even further? Can we do the second sprint, or maybe even the third sprint? Now, I always tell them sprint goals may change, and what is in those sprints as a result of the change of the sprint goal may also change as well. But it's good to kind of see that forecast, and especially to start your next sprint planning session off with hey, we thought we were going to go this direction next time, but based on our previous sprint goal, or maybe over a course of a few days, things have changed. So it's good to, instead of starting with a blank sheet every single time of what do we want our sprint goals to be, we kind of see, oh, hey, this is what we thought last week. This week's way different. Once we get that, we conclude our session, we kind of take a mental break, and then of course we reconvene later, whatever works for the team, later in the week, and do our backlog refinement session, where what we do is we take those user stories that we've set up in those sprint backlogs, go through each one, and refine each user story as a team. Make sure that it's written appropriately, it makes sense to everybody, it's assigned correctly if you want to do pre-assignments. If not, no problem. Not every team is going to be able to handle stories that aren't pre-assigned. So it depends on your team. Nothing wrong there. But we really go through and make sure we agree on the user story, the intent, and the acceptance criteria that's most important.
Okay.
What do you think about that?
Yeah. No, I think that's great.
Well, how do you do yours?
Sprint planning for my team is usually a pretty quick session. What we do is we take advantage of the backlog refinement sessions. So if my sprint is 2 weeks, I try to plan out an hour per sprint week. So Right now, I have teams that are on 2-week sprints, and we do
2-week sprint.
Yeah, 2-week sprints, and we do 2 hours of backlog refinement. And what we do is, I know people are going to hate to hear the whole roadmap, but the reality is, companies do have a roadmap.
Are
they
we
have
there
goals.
yet?
Yeah, they have goals, and actually, that's pretty much how it goes, right? But so no, I mean,
I think Ice Cube made like 3 movies about that, right?
There
He made
you
a
go.
lot of money on that roadmap. Yeah.
So, I mean, it's looking at that roadmap and getting your teams, aligned with those priorities. And so in our backlog refinement sessions, we basically create 2 to 3 sprints out from the one that we're currently working in. And we go through the priorities and we start filling the next few sprints with the stories that are highest in priority. And we review them from a technical perspective as a team. If we have any questions on those stories, we'll have the PO help get some of those questions answered before the team commits to those in the planning session. So, if let's just say, we're comfortable completing a certain amount of stories or certain amount of story points, we fill in the next sprint bucket with that quantity of stories or story points. And then if we have enough time, we start filling the next sprint bucket with the priorities. And so when we get into planning, our planning session is pretty quick. We've pretty much already planned things out. If stories roll over, which you don't want stories to roll over, but sometimes it happens.
Yeah, things will happen.
Yeah, so by the time we get into planning, we look at what stories rolled over and we reprioritize the items that we're about to kick our sprint off with. And, we check to see who's going to go on vacation. So,
capacity planning.
Exactly. Capacity planning, which is that one thing that a lot of people struggle with.
I know.
A lot of organizations struggle with it.
I have to be honest, I'm not doing that yet.
And it's interesting, because that all correlates with your velocity. But anyways, yep. I guess where I was getting at with that is that, so we take advantage of those backlog refinement sessions. We try to plan for the next few sprints based on the priorities and commitments and the roadmap. And, by the time we get into planning, it's a pretty quick session and we just launch our sprint. We set out our sprint goals. The PO provides what the vision is and off we go. And then we go to our daily stand-ups.
Yeah, no, it sounds like a sound way to do it. I mean, I think both, like for sure the way that I do it is definitely different from the way that you do it, but it's not wrong because again, it's what works for the team.
Right.
So I think that's important. And for my organization, for the project that I'm working on, for the teams, plural, that I'm working with, it definitely works for them. So I agree. And I think that's what also kind of calls back to one of our previous episodes that has definitely been getting some traction, is that's the sign of a good Scrum Master is to be able to adjust their activities, their Scrum ceremonies, to what works for the team. So they know what the book says, what the Scrum Guide says, or what the Scrum Guide doesn't say. And they're able to make it work for their team so that you can do what matters most, which is deliver the product on time, get feedback, and iterate.
And the one thing I will say is people. And Scrum Masters out there, POs, take advantage of those backlog refinement sessions to identify dependencies between teams because you haven't committed to those stories yet. So it gives you an opportunity to go back and work with the teams that you have dependencies on so that you don't launch the sprint and you end up failing a story because you have these dependencies with another team and they're not able to commit to it. So just really be good about getting your teams to think about those dependencies and calling them out before you commit to something. Because the reality is, I know in Agile teams, you want to have your team stacked with everything and you don't have to depend on other people, but a lot of organizations aren't there yet. And so I feel like it's good to identify those dependencies early on and work back with those teams.
Agreed.
To get those, worked out before your team commits.
Totally.
Teams, yeah.
Yeah. So to kind of go back on this, or go back, how do you say that? To kind of
rewind.
Yeah. To kind of take a look back at our different styles. For me, sprint planning is planning out at, I don't want to say at a high level, but kind of planning out what you need in order to accomplish your sprint goal. Backlog refinement is you go and you take a deep dive into each user story as a team, go through, make sure the acceptance criteria works, make sure it makes sense for your team. Your style,
which is I take care of that in the backlog refinement sessions where we look and dive into stories in detail. Oftentimes we'll struggle a little bit to get through some of them because there's a lot of technical discussions that we go through for every story, which I think is good. A lot of people say, oh, backlog refinement should move quickly. Well, I don't see it that way. I see it as a good starting point for my developers to have a conversation on how they want to approach something, right? Everybody offers a different way of doing things. And this is the point that we discover, maybe we actually don't need to do that work, or we've done that work in the past. So maybe we can just leverage what we've already done. Yeah. And then, I also try and get the team to story point during backlog refinement. So we know what we look like for our next few sprints.
And I apologize if I forgot that part, but yeah, no, that's what you want to do is you want to story point, because especially, and I think also the difference between you and I as of right now is that your team is a little bit more mature than my teams are. So I think that we're kind of.
By the way, my teams have always been much more mature than John's.
Whatever.
I'm just joking.
Oh my
I'm kidding.
gosh. No, my guys are amazing.
Yeah.
I'll meet you as a side. We'll have a West Side Story together, and we'll just what is that? Like you snap and have a dance off? Or
I absolutely love my teams.
There you go. Sounds good.
Do.
I only saw like West Side Story once, so I think they made me watch it in like 7th grade or
Yeah,
something.
because you probably had to read the book too.
I think I had to write something on it.
Good.
Yeah. Oh, good?
Good.
Oh.
It's a good learning opportunity, right?
Yeah, sure. West Side Story.
Yeah,
right.
exactly.
Sounds good.
So yeah, I think we touched on some of the key points. Just something I'll add here, which I think is really good. It's not necessarily backlog. It sort of is backlog refinement, but I think it's always good for, as you're reaching the end of a quarter, I think it's good maybe about a month before the end of the quarter to go back as a team and inspect to see where you're at in terms of your deliverables, to find out if there is stuff that maybe the team committed to in Q1 or Q2, or whatever the quarter was that they worked on. But I think it's good to go back and reflect on, did we meet everything that we were going to commit to in this quarter, or are there items that are going to spill into the next quarter? Because for me, I think that it's really good to communicate to your PO where we're at in terms of meeting our goals, because you have sprint goals, but you also have goals as an organization based on quarters, based on year.
Like a sprint backlog cleanup or something?
It can be a cleanup, or it can just be gauging, hey, here's where we're at and how much more you need in order to finish the quarterly quarterly goals. And also it's also a form of release planning, if you will, which is getting into the next quarter and starting to plan out your high-level epics as well as your high-level user stories, so you get a good idea of what's to come for the next quarter and what to expect. I think teams really like to know that. And it gives you the ability to map out those dependencies early on, especially if it's like architectural stuff that you're going to do POCs.
Yeah,
it's just the reality, right? There's dependencies everywhere. And so, I like to do it again at the sprint level, but I also like to do it at a higher roadmap level. And I know people probably won't like hearing that.
Roadmap.
But I think it's healthy. So I think this is a really good discussion. Again, like everyone, you kind of have to adjust the ceremonies to how you see fit for your team. And I think the takeaway though is that backlog refinement is super necessary.
Oh yeah.
And so is your sprint planning. So don't skip out on those.
Exactly. And no matter which way you decide to do it, however you want to facilitate it as a Scrum Master, it makes you a good Scrum Master and is would you say sign of a good Scrum Master, Christine?
I think it's a sign of a good Scrum Master that's helping their team move along.
Exactly. To be able to adjust, to adjust the Scrum ceremony to what works for the team.
Yeah, that works.
And on that, thank you for playing along with us on the Agile Standup. Today, we discuss the importance of sprint planning, backlog refinement, and sprint goals. Do we have any impediments, Christine?
No, but I think I could use beer or wine right about now.
I think that's about right, too. Yeah, we're going to go and take off and take care of that. We're going to remove that impediment, I think.
Yeah.
So then after that, do we have any impediments?
Food? Can we have
That's
food?
Another impediment. We'll take care of that. So drinks and food. And then after that,
we have no impediments after that.
That's exactly
totally
what I want to
happy
hear.
And moving along.
No impediments, good to go.
Awesome.